So this is sort of ironic that Lauryn and I are here together because we used to work at Wine and Spirits magazine together. Lauryn was the queen of the tastings department, tracking thousands of wines a year through our offices and tasting thousands of wines a year. And our office happens to be on 32nd Street between 5th and Broadway, the heart of Little Korea. And because kimchi is rather pungent, while tastings go on, there's no kimchi allowed in the office. So, um, but I'm glad that we have finally managed to bring kimchi and wine together here. So
No, somehow, magically, it's this parallel theme in my life: wine and kimchi and wine.
but I want to know, because that Wine and Spirits, that was many years ago, and from there you've worked. You went to the other side and managed a portfolio, and you've gone and worked harvests, and then all of a sudden I turned around and you were making kimchi. So how did you make that leap from fermenting grapes to fermenting vegetables?
Yeah, I don't know that it was really intentional, but I think in the journey, and I think about 3 years ago when I was downsized from my job at the moment. And, I had this epiphany. I took a trip and I love going to Europe. So it was one of those trips, and I was in Barcelona. I was tasting different flavors, and this kind of light bulb moment where, it really was the flavors that I was tasting and the tanginess and something, kind of really sparked. And I came back and, really thought about this kimchi that my mom had, in her business for 23 years at the restaurant in California. I mean, she used to pack this kimchi for me, like in my luggage every time, I'd go visit her in LA. So it became just something that I just felt like, this kimchi is something that is, if people really understood, or Americans, the general public really understood what kimchi is, and not just that thing that's sold in a big jar in an Asian grocery store that smells bad, that they really understood the idea of the handcraftedness, and the same way that it's like winemaking or cheese making. It really kind of came clear to me that it really was the same thing. So it was something that really kind of became then the mission to start the Mother-in-law's Kimchi.
So first question, who is the mother-in-law? I've always wondered this.
Everybody always asks who the mother-in-law is. And well, the name of my mom's restaurant is called Mother-in-law's House, Changmojip, which really translates, there's so many kind of endearing kind of term associated with the term mother-in-law and cooking and cuisine. And in this case, Changmojip is a reference that the bridegroom will go and taste the cooking of the mother-in-law-to-be's house in order to, before he marries the bride, to make sure that the culinary skill is up to snuff. So it's really rather important that the mother-in-law would, try and spoil the bridegroom to make sure that, he'll take the daughter and that, she'll pass the test. But also, alternatively, mother-in-law, it turns out, was also, you learned how to make kimchi, which is one of the most revered, most important culinary skill when you married into your husband's family. So you kind of learned the kimchi making from the mother-in-law too. So there's a lot of just terms of endearment with food and mother-in-law. Ironically, not the same as in the West, though.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Sort of exactly the opposite. But sorry. In your book, though, you talk about how your mom warned you to kind of not eat kimchi in public and not take it out. So I'm very curious what your mom said when you told her your new plan for a business.
I think she kind of thought, like, let's see how long this one's going to last. But yeah, I mean, it was one of those things I grew up with my entire life. And just like, I think like many people, and, I started to really kind of fall in love with Western traditions. And that was more exciting to me, and learning about wine or cheese making. And, I mean, Korean food was just something that was always around, but I really didn't see much, like interest in it really. And, but I always loved being in the restaurant business and, really learning about food, traveling and understanding cultures. And so those things were always natural tendencies for me. And so I think that just kind of really took me then to to really kind of get into the kimchi business. I mean, she told me that, when I was little, like I think most often, growing up bicultural, it was really like, don't ever eat kimchi in front of a non-Korean person because it's offensive, it's stinky, and no one wants to be your friend. So it was something that I was kind of ashamed to kind of really think about kimchi or Korean food. And even though I was growing up in Southern California, where there was the largest amount of Koreans, but still in the 70s and 80s, you're still very much trapped in your own world. Which is very separate, and you're kind of always bracing between this, straddling between these two worlds of, am I Korean, am I American, and food has so much to do with that. So definitely, my mom, who loves to share food with everyone, said don't share kimchi. And so ironically, it just turns out that through this book and the business, I'm sharing kimchi with the world. So.
I'm curious how, when you started the business, I mean, right now pickles are very, very hot, right? Everyone's making pickles,
Right.
but kimchi is another branch of the pickle world. And there are many misconceptions around kimchi. So how did your friends react when you said you were going to start making kimchi, and how was it launching the business at first?
Well, I mean, I think it was just so pure and great about living in a city like New York City. So, I mean, I've been living here about 13 years, but just because, I mean, I guess having kimchi or talking about kimchi amongst people who already know kimchi versus, my friends who really had a fresh sort of take on it and didn't have any aspects of what kimchi is supposed to taste like or not, but just enjoyed good food and quality of food and authentic food. I mean, I think that those were the criteria in which, I presented this idea of, I think, should I modify this recipe? Maybe it's too Korean, maybe it's too spicy. Should I take out less chili pepper? Should I take out not the oysters? What should I? Oh, don't change a thing. Like, keep it perfectly the way that it is, because, there is this feeling, and I think it's just, and New York has a large part to do with it, but I think all over America, it's this kind of real rekindling of, what is authentic and what is genuine and what is traditional.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, didn't modify anything. So, yeah.
At the same time, do you get a lot of people calling you up, freaking out that their jars are bubbling
up all the time? Is it safe to eat? It's bubbling up. It's gurgling. It's making hissing sounds. Like, exactly. It exploded on me, and then I get like, I was wearing white pants, and I opened it, and it was like, well, first of all, you should always open a jar of kimchi over the sink. But yeah, so it's really having to really, a lot of times just being able to, for people to really understand what is happening inside that jar. So, and I think as a Korean person, we've all seen kimchi and our mothers, putting it in the sink. We've seen it overflow. We've seen it, in all different states, put it, in the corner somewhere, like, put it outside. I mean, there's this kimchi maintenance that as a Korean person, yeah. But so I think there's just been a lot of that, in terms of me having to really explain to someone because everything that's happening with kimchi and the natural fermentation process is the opposite of what I think in American foods and and American canned pickles, which
right.
is already vinegar acidified.
They are what they are.
Yeah, they're already done. They're finished products. So right. They tell you not to eat anything that is bulging lids or bubbling. Yeah. So it's like I'm telling them the opposite. Like, oh no, it's okay to eat that. Right. So it's really, I think I can see why for most Americans it was a very kind of thing that they really have to try and understand. So I think a lot of that was just kind of led to the book to say, okay, it's perfectly natural fermentation, and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's a very interesting parallel to wine or cheese as well, that it is alive. In fact, right. It is always changing.
It is always changing. I remember that motto too from the magazine whenever we'd open up wine, and then it's changing in your glass during the day,
over the next few days,
next days, yeah. So it's really that aspect of something that's captured in time and something that's natural. It's not manufactured or a finished product. Yeah.
Now, something that you mentioned in the video and that I've heard you talk about before is aging kimchi.
Right.
Now, this is something that you encourage?
It's yeah. Yeah, and that's something that is, I think very cultural. I mean, although you can really say it depends on, some people really like the fresher kimchi. They like it aged. How fermented of a kimchi do you enjoy? And it can just be enjoyed in so many different ways. But, I grew up I think in a Korean family where if something was like past the initial state of fermentation, so it's bright, just starting to pickle and super fresh, meaning like 3 or 4 days or something. But then just after that point, it's like, my mom and I argue about this all the time. Oh no, it's too aged. Oh no, it's gone over the hill. Oh no, we got to make soup out of it. Like, because that's like the ultimate sort of, it's somehow degraded in quality. And so I, naturally thought, oh, that's, I guess you just eat it fresh, and until I really kind of started this kimchi business and started to really, make batches on my own, jar it, keep it, and I would just go on these crazy experimentations where I would keep jarred kimchi for 6, 8, 9 months and try and taste them side by side. And the more and more I kind of really got into the taste of the kimchi, I started to really have a deeper understanding and appreciation, and really, I became this person that now like really likes aged, shin kimchi, which really means like it's like tangy and acidified, in Korean. Like it's, but which I always thought, really means that it's like has a negative connotation. But to me, it's more like, naturally makes more sense. Like, if you took a bottle of really delicious aged wine, that's going to cost more than something that's fresh and you got to eat right away. I mean, that it takes time to develop those flavors and characters. So,
Well, like wine, though, also, do the flavors change to become more layered, more complex, more?
yeah, and I think that is the idea behind something that is a very well crafted, balanced kimchi that you can, age over time. It's going to just taste better. It's going to give you complexity of flavor over time. Yeah. So now, I mean, I still debate with my mom. It's about what, it's just, I'm like, it's too fresh. I can't eat it, and so she'll give me the older batch, if you will. But it's something that I think is really interesting, maybe culturally. But it's been my experience also that I feel like in the Western palate, that tanginess is something that is people just kind of can associate more with than something that's super fresh kimchi. So
Interesting. So we could meet again in another couple of years and do like a vertical kimchi tasting.
yeah, right. Yeah, although I mean, I really tell people that we can, that there's no expiration date with kimchi, So yeah, but I don't know. No one's called me yet and said I've got, a 4-year-old kimchi of mother-in-law's jar. Like, what should I do?
I'm going to start. I'm going to start a kimchi cellar, separate from my wine cellar.
Right.
So, one of the things in the cookbook that fascinated me so much is all the different things you can make kimchi from. And so I was wondering, I mean, people often think of kimchi as just being cabbage, but you've got kimchi recipes for all sorts of things, for fruits and for butternut squash and things. So I was wondering, sort of, what are the basic? Can you kimchi anything? And can you use kimchi as a verb too, like that?
You can. It's an adjective, it's a verb, it's a noun, it's a thing. Yeah, you can kimchi just about anything. The only caveat is that the aspect of kimchi, and it's by definition is salted vegetables. So it's really taking the salt and taking a brine of the vegetable, and having the catalyst of the bacteria, the living bacteria in the vegetable and in the air, and then it's just acidifying using with salt. So you can kimchi just about anything. The only caveat is that the flavors of that vegetable when it's fresh, and then when it turns to and it ferments, it changes. So you got to kind of like that flavor that it changes into. So for instance, I took like bok choy and I tried to kimchi that. didn't really like it. You could have it fresh, but like to age it, it just kind of brings out a lot of bitterness. So, so there are reasons why you've got certain summer vegetables that are very tender and peak, and you don't really want to age that very long. And that's why there are summer quick kimchis that I say, oh, literally you kind of dress it with a little bit of salt, and then that vegetable is slightly cured, and then you eat it right away. Using like Brussels sprouts was never, I think, a good idea. And I think, David Chang from Momofuku brought up that idea that it's like, well, it just seems so perfect. It's a mini little cabbage. Why couldn't you make kimchi out of Brussels sprouts? Well, no, it just doesn't work, So there are and broccoli rabe, I tried it. It was little weird, So I mean, so there are definitely, but trying like the cauliflower was another really great one that that came out of experimentation, but it really just being able to take the seasonal produce at its peak, from the warmer weathers to winter climates, and really being able to make kimchi out of that. It's something that's very unique, and just obviously not just limited to what's in the book, but hopefully can get people really excited about experimenting and trying different vegetables.
Right. That's another way that kimchi reminds me of wine, in that you start with grapes and then you make wine out of them, and you don't really have an idea. You have an idea, a general idea of what it's going to taste like, but it doesn't taste like a grape in the end. So
right.
It's really hard to extrapolate and think, what is this going to taste like at the end of that process?
Right.
So.
Yeah, because I mean, it's always, to me, you have your cured, vegetable and your seasoning, whatever, but what it tastes like when you initially taste it and how it tastes after it's been aged it's so different, and that's like the magical part too. But yeah, and very much just like wine, it all looks like the same, and the bottle, it's red, white, but it all tastes slightly different.
And do you ever have the sort of experience that you might with a wine, where you taste it at the beginning, after it's with wine, like after it's finished fermenting, or even when it's fermenting, you're like, ooh, I think I made a mistake. I don't think this is going to be good. But if you wait it out, then
oh yeah, and there's definitely that moment in the initial fermentation of kimchi where it's converting its the lactic acid, and it's like, and the smell that especially that the cabbage gives out, as well as daikon radish, which is a very hardy root vegetable, is this like carbon dioxide. It's like the breaking down of the structure of the vegetable, and it's stinky, it's smelly, and but it's like that initial part. There's a bitterness of the changing that happens in the kimchi until, and my mom always tells me the story about even people that that really think that if you open it too early and before it ferments, then there's a real bitterness to the vegetable, and it's unpleasant. It's like a metallic taste. But you've got to kind of weigh that out, and then it kind of has to change and convert the sugars. Yeah.
So patience is a virtue when it comes to kimchi.
Yeah.
That's good to know. But that also brings up, like, when your recipes, you have a combination of contemporary ones that you've invented, and then traditional ones.
Right.
And well, first I'm just curious, like, which was more difficult there, coming up with brand new recipes, or getting traditional recipes out of people who probably never measure their ingredients or take notes on what they're doing? And
I mean, it was a real kind of balance, and I think that by having the foundational recipes of a traditional, authentic kimchi recipe, I was able to then play around with different ideas about it. But just like anything, and I think researching for the book, doing the same sort of the chili pepper flakes and the garlic and ginger and the protein components, so whether that's the salted shrimp or the fish sauce, and really getting an understanding of the kimchi pantry and why those seasonings work together to create a balanced fermentation, was really interesting. Because if I didn't put the fish sauce, or if I didn't put in the shrimp, if I just used vegan ingredients, it was tangier or sharper. It's like, it's that kind of like fine blending, and all those ingredients, what you put in, what you don't put in, all make a difference in the finished product. But I think as far as the authentic kimchi, yeah, I mean, it was really, not the easiest thing, and I never thought that I would be able to write a cookbook about Korean food because, anytime you ask your grandmother or your mother how to make something, they're like, "Oh, no, you can't use any measuring cups. Oh, no, you don't. Like, there's no book for this.
Right.
It's just a little bit of this and a little bit of that." So it was a lot of just observing and trying to measure where there was no measuring spoon, and really trying to repeat things and have it in a format that was really something that any American kind of kitchen can work with, because I really wanted to make it accessible and not too obscure. That it had to be some exact way to do something, but hopefully that the foundational recipes can serve as basis to make the kimchi, the authentic traditional kimchi, as well as some non-traditional kimchi.
And so you talk a lot about balance in your kimchi, and I'm wondering, like, if I'm go off to experiment with some kimchi, like, how do I know when I've hit that spot? What are you looking for? What is that magic?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, but I think that it's to me it relates to the way that I learned about, when I learned about winemaking or wine tasting, and like that job that I had, at Wine and Spirits, where my job was to open up all the wines and make sure that they weren't corked, and really just tasting hundreds of wines. And what it really helped me, I think, understand is the taste of fermentation, and that really is this kind of sweet and bitterness, of tanginess, and something that is, like, to me, always kind of happening whenever you taste wine. And food is the same way. When you're cooking, you're adding flavor, you're adding fat, you're putting acid, you're putting salt, and so it's that sort of balance of something that's pleasant, but it's really, you can't quite pinpoint, like, as it's just one thing or next.
Well, it's
So
almost maybe not so much a flavor as it
right.
is a sensation,
Yeah, like a
right?
textural thing that's going on in your mouth.
Yeah.
So to me, when I taste kimchi and I taste the chili pepper flakes, which are spicy but like fruity and earthy, and then I've got garlic and ginger, which are these kind of really strong ingredients, especially fresh. And those things kind of come to life, with the seasoning. And so I don't know how else to describe it, but there's a vibrancy to me of those flavors that come together with the vegetables, and they kind of tone out, during the fermentation, and they kind of meld together and like become happy friends. I
Right,
don't know.
right. But that is one of the characteristics of anything fermented when you think of it, whether it's cheese or
Right.
wine or kimchi, that the flavors are not flat,
Right.
right? They
They
feel
come
very
alive
alive,
right.
and part of that is just acidity, of course, but it's also all the other things that are going on in there, and the fact that it is alive.
Right. And
And
my mom, will describe that taste, that is just like that kind of, it's not tanginess, but it's like, that, like, in Korean, they say it's like, my mom would say it's like saida, like it's just like a 7-Up kind of sensation, like this carbonation, in the back at the end. And it's like, ooh, that's like bubbly and lovely.
we could say it's a champagne,
Yeah, champagne,
right?
that's
Okay.
right. That's the champagne part. The champagne of pickles, right.
In your book, that you also cook with kimchi a lot. So how do the flavors change when you apply heat, basically?
Yeah, well, I had so many customers that I would always say, okay, always the first question was, what is kimchi? And then the second question is, what do you do with it? So
You eat it.
other than I'm like,
Question.
well, you can, it's a condiment. You can put it just about anything, eggs, hot dogs, sausages, you name it. But the idea of cooking with kimchi now, and my, understanding of it in Korean food is that, like, again, so it goes back to the idea, like, so once kimchi has been really super aged and then it's got a lot of tanginess, then you use it as an ingredient. But especially when I started to make kimchi jjigae with it and so forth, something about the kind of then all of a sudden this dead, lifeless kind of cabbage once I put it in heat and put olive oil on it. And, I love the smell of cooking with kimchi because it has the other earthly kind of aromas that come up. So then all of a sudden I smell more of the fish sauce. I smell more of the umami notes that really is a byproduct of fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I smell all those things when I'm cooking, and I feel like all of a sudden this little piece of what I thought was like a dead cabbage is coming back to life. Now, the live probiotic aspects of that bacteria is kind of done when you're cooking it in heat.
Sure.
But then I think that there's a real value to using kimchi as an ingredient because you really, with the cabbage kimchi, you get the smokiness. With the chili peppers, you get another kind of earthiness. And so there's these different flavors that really kind of come into play that's very different than, what I would think that, you can just add some chili pepper flakes or hot sauce, or vinegar to flavor your food. And then you really get this flavor of kimchi in whatever you're cooking. So whether it's rice or chicken or, putting it in, just it really kind of gives it a nice sort of subtlety to the food and what you're cooking. So I really enjoyed experimenting with a lot of those dishes.
Do you have any absolute favorite recipes in the book?
Oh, that's tough.
Just to put you on the spot, sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, using it and eggs, I mean, that you can really use kimchi and you can use it delicately and put it in sauces, cream sauces. I mean, I did like in the cookbook, there's one for kimchi fried rice, which is a classic. But then I tried it on a risotto recipe because I love making risotto. So I thought, well, why not? Let me see if the cheese and risotto go together. And it's such a beautiful, interesting just flavor. Like it tastes a little bit like this melted cheese, but then you get this kimchi flavor. And then visually, it's just really pretty. But it's just kind of a play on, you don't have to have like one thing and not the other. It's just there's just really no rules. I mean, and because I love kind of Mediterranean food, Italian food, French food, or those things that were real influences for me, I really wanted to try and play the role of, how kimchi can be incorporated in those other dishes as well. So, I mean, I had a lot of people that thought, you're writing a kimchi book and they're not all Korean dishes. Like, what are you thinking? What, you're making grilled cheese sandwiches with kimchi and
now they're on the menu at Sexelby, in fact.
So it was not something that entirely everyone agreed, that it was a good idea, but I really felt that it was an important one to let people know that no, you don't have to have kimchi only with Korean food. In fact, it really can be much more contemporary and have a much broader scope. So
I was also really surprised by the seasonality in your book. You actually have it set up by seasons.
Yeah, and I mean, that was just such a really fortunate experience. I think having grown up in Southern California, it was really easy to forget the seasons. And then also, being Korean, you always had a big jar of Napa cabbage or kimchi in your fridge at all time, at least a gallon of kimchi, or more than 1 gallon. So it was kind of, it was easy to lose sight of the seasonal aspects of kimchi making, what that really means. But I think when I started Mother-in-Law's Kimchi and I began the business participating at the local regional market at New Amsterdam Market and South Street Seaport, so that was all about using the seasonal local farm produce at a hand and being able to share your product that way. So then all of a sudden I had to think, oh, it's summer, I gotta only, make cucumber kimchi, or oh, it's, winter, so now I can make cabbage kimchi. And then it really reinforced the idea, and especially for me, my memories of Korea and watching my grandmother make kimchi and the aspect of kimjang and kimchi making, and that, so much of this kimchi culture is tied in with an agrarian culture, which is such a part of Korea. So it's naturally very seasonal, and yet a lot of the the comments from my customers were really like pointing at the cabbage kimchi. That's kimchi, right? And not really realizing that no, everything's really kimchi. So it's not just made with cabbage. So I think it was really important to be able to show the seasonality of it, and it's just a perfect thing to just be able to enjoy the summer, cucumber kimchi and the in summertime and have something that's really hearty, like a root vegetable, like chonggak kimchi, the bachelor radish kimchi or something, in the winter, and see how just the breadth and the scope of those flavors and the vegetables that are so tied to the earth and who we are. So,
Well, also just your mention of the white kimchi made me think about how you mentioned that red pepper
yeah.
was not a part of the original kimchi recipe.
Right.
In fact,
I mean, that was really
and this is
interesting, and I learned
fascinating.
about the researching the book that it was really until like about the 17th, latter part of the 17th century, that Koreans had access to chili pepper flakes because they come from South America, and so I mean, there's a couple different versions of the story, but the way that I understood it is that it came through South America through Japan and through Portugal, but up until that point, so most of all the kimchi, I mean, all the kimchi, they didn't have, chili pepper flakes. And so they're much similar to then the flavors are probably much similar to then, the sauerkraut making or any of the Eastern European traditions where they didn't use chili pepper flakes. And yet I'm sure the Koreans, being resourceful as we are, just, took chili peppers and decided that they were going to put it in everything because, what better way to stretch your meal and your vegetables and your food. Was also interesting, though, is that the usage of chili pepper flakes, especially during this fermentation process, and kind of gets rid of that. Sometimes you get this pink foam and stuff that can happen with, with sauerkraut or making fermenting vegetables that, so I think that the chili pepper flakes have this antioxidant role of really being able to preserve and extend the fermentation. So it really makes sense to me. I mean, and then not to mention that and the type of chili pepper flakes for the gochugaru and the Koreans, that's in Korean cuisine is really is much milder, even though it's a crimson, beautiful red. The spice is more moderate, and it really has more earthy, kind of fruity role. So I think that also goes well with the garlic and ginger and the other flavors that come together.
Right,
So, yeah.
right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the chili pepper idea. People hear that and they think, oh, it's going to be very, very spicy.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to reach for a beer instead of going with wine.
Right, right.
But it's not actually that hot.
Right, right. So yeah, so it really, yeah. So I think it's a lot of just, but it's really difficult to answer that question when a customer asks you, well, how hot is it? And everybody's idea of heat and spice is so personal that it's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
I sometimes have people get mad at me because I refuse to answer it. So Tara, so we, I feel like we've just been talking about so much about kimchi, but there's so many parallels. So I think I was getting a little bit into the idea of the fermentation, but like, how do you sort of really see the parallel and the of kimchi and wine tasting and
kimchi and well, basically, I think you had said it right on when you were talking about the taste of fermentation. There being that tang. And when I think about the taste of fermentation, it's funny because I never thought of fermentation in those terms until you had said it. But if you think of wine, beer, cheese, everything that is fermented does have this tang, and it's it's acidity, but it's also just this spark of life. It's the thing that makes cheese not just taste like preserved milk, or that makes wine taste like something besides just a dried fruit, right? So it's that the taste of fermentation is sort of the life force within it, and also all of the complexity that the process brings to it. All those things that you can't really put your finger on and describe, right?
I know, and the thing that I always that I try to get people to understand what they're tasting when they, especially when I have customers for the first time that taste kimchi for the first time and say, oh, this is my first time tasting kimchi and I love it, and they don't really, I think that, and the closest thing that they know to like sort of the tanginess and they associate with is the vinegar, pickle, but I think it tastes very different than a vinegar pickle.
Well, it's a softer. I mean, to me, it's a softer acidity. Vinegar is very harsh,
Right.
and the acidity that you find. Basically, if your wine tastes like vinegar to you, that it's gone wrong, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
wine has great acidity, but good wine has great acidity, but it's a softer acidity, and it's more integrated with everything else. Just the
Right.
same way, I think in kimchi, the acidity is integrated. It's natural, right? It's part of the vegetable,
Right.
rather than taking a pickle and dumping a vinegar solution over it and preserving it like that.
Right. Yeah. So I've been telling people, well, the magic of kimchi is that we don't add vinegar. It makes its own vinegar. Ah,
Right,
okay.
right. Everything is more cohesive in that way.
Right. And what do you think, are the challenges of then or general wine pairing, sort of when you're thinking about wine and vinegar and the idea of acidity and
I mean, in general, there's two. To be very general, there's two ways to go about pairing, and that is one is to go for a contrast, and the other is to match similarities. So, with acidity, for instance, you can imagine taking a high acid wine and placing it with something that's very creamy or very rich. Because if you had something that was creamy and rich with that, something to drink that was creamy and rich with that creamy and rich dish, it could just be too much.
yeah.
It's just. But the acidity against that creamy rich dish might brighten it. But now you could take that a little bit too far. If you think of like a salad with a really vinegary vinaigrette on it and a crisp light white wine, those vinegars are going to come together, or those acidities are going to come together, and it could just taste sour. Not
Well, that's
not
I mean,
nice.
I would automatically think like, what, kimchi and wine? It just sounds like it's going to be sour next to sour.
But I don't think it's true at all. I mean, actually, it was one of the things. This is quite honest. One of the things that I learned in tasting Lauryn's kimchi, many different flavors of them, is that in a good kimchi, the flavors there's so much more going on than just acidity and heat. Because you taste the vegetable underneath, and you taste you taste the chili, but it's not just hot. It's not heat. It's fruit. It's an earthy flavor. It's a smoky flavor. The acidity isn't a sharp vinegary one. It's a round one. You have all these different things going on. You have this earthy umami flavor as well, and so in that way, to me, it's not acidity is not what I'm thinking about when I'm pairing a wine with kimchi. In fact, I've actually come to really like sitting with a glass of white wine before dinner and some Daikon kimchi, and just nibbling on it before my dinner's finally ready. So to me, kimchi and acidity, it's not that big of a problem in general. In pairing wine and food, acidity is something you want to keep in mind when you're looking for a pairing. You don't want too much acidity, and the contrast can work really well. But also acidity, if it's contained, sort of, it can work really, really well. And I hope that you'll see this in some of the combinations that we picked out.
And what about spicy food and wine then?
The thing with spice is that alcohol can actually read in a wine as spice. It can give you actually a sense of heat on your palate, or it could give a white pepper burn. And sometimes when alcohol meets spice, like pepper spice, it just bursts into flame on your tongue. And
yeah, I mean, I've had that experience where you're just like,
Sure.
There's big Shiraz wine or something, and you had to just
Right, it's 15% alcohol, and it's not a nice reaction. And this is one of the reasons why beer, of course, is the go-to thing. It's generally lower in alcohol, and it's not going to fan. Of course, anybody knows too that if you actually have some really super spicy food, you should just leave the alcohol alone and go for the rice and the water. But
I know you said that when we were talking about your experience in Hong Kong and having the food there, because you said, oh, we should try a red wine with one of your kimchi, and I thought, what, crazy.
But I mean, this was fascinating to me. I was in Hong Kong last year, and there's always this idea, oh no, you can't do red wine with spicy food because red wine generally has higher alcohol, very generally speaking, has higher alcohol than white wines, and it's got tannins. Like when you oversteep your tea, that drying sensation, those are the tannins. And when tannin and heat come together, it can be a really unpleasant sensation. It accentuates the spiciness. It accentuates the bitterness of the spice. But if you have something that's not too tannic, and if you like the sensation of heat, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So when I was in Hong Kong, everyone was pairing the local food with red wines, and I thought, oh, this is just because they love their old Bordeaux, and this isn't actually about the taste of the food. And in fact, it was entirely about how well the red wine went with the food. That there's several different things going on there, but one is that red wine has red fruit flavors, so it sort of echoes the red fruit of the chili spice, right? A pepper is a fruit, and the red version is the ripe version of it. So, so you get this really nice echo of the red fruit when you have a red wine with it. But also, if you have a little alcohol and it accentuates that spice, but you like the spice in the first place, this isn't a bad thing.
Yeah. No,
so this was a huge revelation to me.
Yeah, and we have a red wine that matches with our house Napa Cabbage Kimchi. So I mean,
I think it was actually the best pairing of all the ones that we.
I was totally blown away that I was like, no, we can't have a red wine with kimchi. Like that just doesn't seem right. And I was humbled and wrong. I mean, it really was that taste sensation of all of a sudden, even the spiciness of that kimchi was just kind of becoming floral and like more like a fruit, like you said.
Right.
And it just did and because this and the red wine is because it's a very soft.
Yeah, the red wine that we picked in this case, generally when you go for red wine with spicy food, you either want to pick a very old one so that it doesn't have such aggressive tannin any longer, or you want to pick one that doesn't have very much tannin to begin with. So we have a Beaujolais, which is it's a very fresh wine, and it's made from a grape that's very low in tannins. So you get the nice fruitiness and the sweetness of the fruit against the spice of the kimchi, and I think it also plays up all the earthy flavors and the complexity of your.
Right. So I mean, I felt like when we were going through the kimchi and wine pairings, it was just so fun because it just had so much kind of really movement, going on. It's like, wow, what are we tasting? Whoa, flavors, wow. Like, are they working together? Are they not? But you want to go a little bit into the individual pairings.
What we actually picked, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the very first pairing that we have is with your vegan Napa Cabbage kimchi. And maybe first you should explain what makes it vegan?
So yeah, generally, and that's like probably the third question. Kimchi is not vegan? I didn't know it could not be vegan. Well,
right.
In the kimchi pantry, fish sauce is part of something that's in most every Asian culture that you use for cooking. So there's fish sauce, and then shrimp paste. It's seojeot in Korean that is mostly in most of the kimchi. And so these two are like proteins that are just you use that to really build a umami notes, in your kimchi sauce. So our vegan kimchi is just, doesn't have the most typical, fish sauce or shrimp paste in it, and it's just, chili pepper, garlic, ginger. So you get a very clean note. So this kimchi kind of ferments quicker, but it really has a tangy kind of pure notes. So to me, whenever I taste the vegan, it's missing that back note of a sort of a kimchi, but it has these very clean, sharp notes.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that actually made it a little bit challenging to find a wine to go with it, because it has delicacy. It has a lot of delicacy, and that's why in the end we went with a sparkling wine. And actually, this was Lauryn's pick.
Yeah, the go-to kimchi wine. Yeah.
The go-to kimchi wine, exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think sparkling wine is always a great pick when it comes to spicy food.
Right.
Because sort of by definition, the alcohol is going to be fairly low. But then you also have the bubbles, and
Yeah.
that they, bubbles make everything better, really.
Yeah. And this one to me has just a slightly ever so sweet off dry kind of hint
Hmm.
that really seems to help out the whatever kind of, too much spice or whatever that's going on. So it
Right.
kind of also has a double effect of kind of cleansing that, kind of giving it a light
Right.
coating, right?
And it's also a Gruner Veltliner, which is a grape from Austria, and Gruner Veltliner is just sort of famous for being very vegetable friendly. So,
Yeah. It's the
this
wine that
is
goes with the asparagus, right?
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it definitely
It's the
goes well.
asparagus wine.
As far as I'm concerned, it goes well with anything in the summertime,
Right.
and in the wintertime too. But it's the perfect vegetable wine. So, um, yeah, that's why we picked that wine. And then you have the house Napa Cabbage Kimchi, which is
Yeah, and
much
that's
deeper, more umami flavored, and
it's the number one seller, in our portfolio, a small portfolio. But House Napa Cabbage is the recipe that comes from my mom's 25-year-old restaurant, Salangtang restaurant. So it's the House Napa Cabbage. It's long strips of cabbage, which is kotjeri style. So it's really kind of, I like it the way that it's, and ironically, and I talk about it in the book, I think traditionally Koreans, you're not supposed to eat kotjeri aged, you're supposed to eat it very fresh. And so what I'm doing is completely wrong, but I don't care because I really like it. So I think that the length of the kotjeri, which means really you keep it in long strips of cabbage, helps the longer fermentation because it helps it to ferment slower than if you were chopped up, vegetables. And the thing with our House Napa Cabbage recipe is that it really has this kind of thick, almost complex, kind of viscous taste because it's not vegan. We have shrimp paste and fish sauce, and we also have a proprietary little beef stock. So it really gives it this richness that's very unlike, other kimchi. And it's subtle, but I think that's when you're talking about the layers of flavor
hmm
and especially the length at the end. Then it's also the chili pepper flakes that we use, but it really has this kind of movement.
right.
Yeah.
The thing I remember most about this combination too is that it was remarkable and that it made the wine taste better.
Yeah.
It's a very, very simple wine. It's just fruity, fun. It was pressed. It was hanging on the vines in September, and it's in the bottle now. So there's no complexity at all. It's not meant to have any complexity. But then you have it with the kimchi, which is full of complexity, and it sort of brushes off on the wine. And so the combination was really.
I know this. Yeah, I mean, and the fun history about this wine. Tell us the fun history about the Beaujolais Nouveau every year, the harvest, and they have the date, like you can't open it before the 27th
It's very
every
silly.
year.
Every region of the world has a celebration when they finally get the grapes in and they're fermenting, and the new wine celebration. But the Beaujolais have really got the corner on the market, and Georges de Boeuf is really the person who perfected the whole thing and made it into a international event where the wine is flown over. At one point, it was actually flown over on the Concorde, and you're not allowed to open it until the third Thursday of.
Okay, it's the third Thursday. Yeah, which is it kind of coincides with
Oh no,
Thanksgiving.
I'm sorry, it's not the third Thursday. I've forgotten the date. It is the third Thursday of November. Thank you, Jamal. So yes, it's perfect. It's right around Thanksgiving and goes well with your turkey, especially if you have some kimchi on the table.
I know, if I could just figure out how to sell kimchi to the French, I'd have it made
There you go.
with their wine and then the
Right.
kimchi. So okay.
I think for Christmas, just take a note of her Brussels sprout and kimchi recipe because it's really good.
Yeah. So, and then the next wine or the pairing that we have is the white kimchi. So this is the one with no chili pepper flakes. So this is kind of a really pure kind of tasting kimchi. I mean, it's not completely white. We use a little bit of a bell pepper kind of it's more for kind of color, but it has a really nice sort of clean taste that normally you would have a lot of in the wintertime actually. So it's kind of a classic white kimchi
Right, right.
flavor. So
Yeah, and for that we were looking to accent the or to really bring out the or not, but to accent the freshness of it. Um, but also because the main event there is not the chili, the acidity is more forward. We're really looking for a white wine that had good acidity. But also this wine is a blend of white grapes, but it has a lot of muscat in it, which is very floral. Um, and it really, I think that floral note really combined with the delicacy of the vegetables in the kimchi, and
yeah, it works
just
beautifully. It
yeah.
was I was just having a whole new appreciation of that kimchi with that with that Alsace wine because it's just so pretty, like a flower, and
Yeah, the other thing about this kimchi in particular, but all of your kimchis, they have this sort of transparency where you can see you can taste all the layers, and you can taste right down to the vegetable. And I think the more delicate they are, the more delicate you want the wine to be too, so that you don't trample over that delicacy. So
And then this pairing was just fantastic. So the Mu Daikon radish is the gakdugi or gakdugi kimchi, and then that is paired with the Chenin Blanc from South Africa.
right, yeah. So this is the thing that was really interesting about the daikon kimchi is to me the meatiness of it. That
Yeah,
even though it's a white vegetable and it has a very particular flavor that does have a lot of delicacy. It's got a really meaty texture, and so it could take a bigger wine.
yeah. No, I call the daikon my underdog vegetable. But I know that whenever I taste the daikon radish in a tasting, the men always go for the daikon. And I think there's a saying in Korean, like, it's like the daikon is like the man's like vegetable
Oh,
kind of
really?
thing. Yeah, there's like this hardiness to it, and yet it's just got so much flavor. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And we tried it with the red, and it was okay with the red, but really this white we liked a bit better. It's a Chenin Blanc from South Africa, and the Cuvée V, as it's called, it's off dry. It has a little bit of sweetness to it, and there's something about Chenin Blanc, the grape, that it's got this sort of waxy, broad texture, um, and it often tastes like lanolin to me. Um,
Yeah, which kind of
it's
gives it this kind of viscous kind of,
Yeah,
and yet
exactly.
citrus. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I thought with that and the sweetness, it really stood up to the daikon.
Yeah.
Um, and the sweetness also counters the heat as well.
Right.
Not that there's that much heat in it, um, but I don't know. That I think the daikon is a fun one to play around with all the wines because uh, um, almost everything works with it except for maybe the spar, the muscat blend. So
Yeah. And so really, I think that generally speaking, it's fair to say, like, when you're kind of looking to pair not just fermented food, but Korean food, it seems that there's, the cooler wines, kind of cooler climate
cooler
wines,
climate wines.
work
Yeah, I mean, in
better.
general, I would say yes, that's a good rule to follow. That because cooler climate wines tend to have less alcohol than those grown in warmer climates, and they also tend to have a little bit less body in a good way. So there's more of that transparency.
Yeah.
You can taste the food underneath it. If you have a great big 15% alcohol Shiraz from the Barossa Valley in Australia, then you want a steak or something big and red and meaty.
Yeah.
Something that's going to equal it. But Korean food doesn't that I know of, and from the recipes in your book at any rate, doesn't tend to put a lot of emphasis on great big slabs of red meat. It's more nuanced than
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And I think that is part of the idea of kimchi. And I think as I learned, went through the process of going of writing the book, is that I really, I think oftentimes people think about Korean food and they think, oh, it's just so pungent and spicy and garlicky and it's so big and what do you drink with that? And it just has all this personality. But I think in its core and the that why kimchi is so iconic to Korean cuisine and as a people, it's like you can't think about Korean food or Koreans without kimchi, is that it really, is that sort of the subtle layers of flavor that come from fermentation, which is kimchi. So it kind of goes full circle.
Right.
So in actuality, even though I was writing a book about all these recipes that, chili pepper, garlic, so pungent and all this stuff. But what I came away with is really having a true understanding that of the subtleties, not in a way that, you think about, very austere flavors, but it's all there. It's just really, you got to really look at it as something that is kind of subtle and that comes together.
Mm-hmm.
Because even banchan is like a little bit of this, the colors, and
Right.
it's not supposed to be this, this just Korean barbecue, But anyways, I feel like we kind of covered both the kimchi and the wine, and
I don't know. I wonder if anyone has any questions. Yes.
But realize that you're standing between you and the wine tasting.
So how?
Is it on?
I don't know.
Doesn't sound. Try.
Yes, kimchi seems to me is the most complex of all the pickles from all around the world, and it seems also the most laborious. And I was wondering how kimchi way of making and taste and complexity relates to Korean cuisine in general.
Yeah, excellent question. I think there is a whole just methodology to kimchi and how you treat the vegetable. I mean, so even the seasonals, the way that the recipes are broken down seasonally. So if you take a delicate vegetable like, again, like cucumbers or like, delicate, chives or, it's a quick salted brine versus when you take a winter vegetable, like a root vegetable like daikon radish, you could cure that for 3 days. You can take heads of cabbage and put in a salted brine for overnight. So the methods of making kimchi with that vegetable is very specific to the seasons, and it could be very laborious and take a long time, like you pointed out, or you can make it super quicker, with the summer vegetables that require, I mean, they have more juice, and so but they're also they're not made to be, cured for 3 months through the next season, but there is, yeah, absolutely. I think what the Koreans, what makes kimchi so particularly, interesting about Korean food is that there is more depth and scope. I mean, there's thousands of recipes. Even the fundamental or foundational recipes are in the hundreds. And so I don't know if somebody has ever cataloged how many, what is the exact number of kimchi. But the breadth and scope of, I think, the tradition of kimchi making is very very Korean in that it's tied to the land. Koreans are very much an agrarian culture. So there's a resourcefulness of, having the means to using your vegetables and figuring out ways to make it flavorful and make it last. It's just like the most basic human trait to figure out how you're going to take your food and preserve it. So I think that really is the spirit of it.
That would be true for the entire Korean ways of cooking.
Yeah, I mean, they're really, I think I think the way that I understand the whole aspect of Korean cooking is there's a gentleness, there's a delicacy, there is, rinsing, there is, I mean, the books that I was researching, they talk about how the Koreans don't really believe in chopping up the kimchi too much because they feel that that's like bad. You're hurting the vegetables. So there's this kind of mysterious old sort of tradition of rinsing, and then there's this purification and the salting. And so there's very much this methodology in which there is a true reverence for food and the processing of that food. So that really, and I remember from watching my grandmother, make soybean paste from scratch, or drying the chili peppers, or roasting the soybeans, or foraging for grass and making it in the dinner table. So so with my grandmother, my mother, and I think with the generations of women and ladies, and there is just a reverence to the food. Yeah. So that aspect of it, yeah.
Any? Oh, you got the mic.
I had a question about, Korean food. Different regions in Korea have their own Korean food specialties and their own kimchi recipes, and famous kimchis are from particular areas. Would you say that your kimchi is rooted in a particular geographic region? No pun intended.
That's an excellent question.
How would you sort of characterize the kimchi that you've been cooking?
I think that our kimchi, or the house kimchi that I think is so representative of mother-in-law's kimchi, or that's so special to my heart, and also just the top seller, is that and obviously writing the cookbook, the regional variants of the southern style kimchi versus the northern style. But I really think that our kimchi is like, I call it the Basque style, because it really kind of takes a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It has this shrimp, but it also has, the northern kind of using the beef stock. And, it really is this culmination, because the recipe really is an evolution that is something from my mom's restaurant, and over the course of, 25 years now. And the ladies that sort of all make it, and, and my mom, who's, sort of really overseeing the recipe. So I really think it's the best sort of influence of those things. And to me, it's just like the idea of Basque food, which is, which really kind of means that you're on the border, and you get the regional influence. So if you're on the French side, the Spanish side, you get those kind of influences. So it's really kind of a gypsy kimchi. So, so that's, So, but I really, and also just even my interpretation that, that the gochujang really, in its traditional way, is not supposed to be eaten aged, but I like it aged. I think it tastes better aged. So it's like sort of breaking all the rules.
Sure.
Oh.
On cook last, so you said maybe. Can you tell us a little bit? Can you tell us about the origin of the kimchi? In other words, are there any other country or nation or people under the sky other than Korean who are having kimchi as a regular diet?
Oh yeah, there's many people in the world, and I think that it just came out of necessity. I mean, I didn't study with certainty what other countries, but I know just from my common knowledge that if you look at the climate and how similar it is to, say, someplace like in Eastern Europe or Poland or Russia, or but they also sell vegetables in Nepal, any place that's cold and that's not going to have access to their vegetables during the winter months, have figured out a way that adding salt to their vegetable is the way to preserve it. So, but I think that Koreans, what they've done with the kimchi recipe, probably no other country has done. The hundreds of thousands of recipes that that exist, and so there is a great pride, and I think the breadth of scope that kimchi has a reputation, and Koreans have, because we've really done a lot with it. So, but I think that what's common, throughout the world is that, South America, has kimchi. Every country it's just the most basic way to preserve your vegetables. So, yeah.
Just one quick follow-up question is, I think the kimchi tastes the best or better with traditional hot bowl of rice. Now, now with consumption of rice decreasing in Korea, eating more meat and other, do you think we will come up with a different kind of a kimchi rather than traditional hot stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no limit to coming up with a different, recipe. Yeah. Did I answer that question?
Yeah. Quick question. My understanding of kimchi is that, the fermentation is caused by adding protein to it, and that's how the lactic acid is produced. And if fermentation is a prerequisite for kimchi, how does vegan kimchi work in terms of, what causes the vegan kimchi to ferment?
It's just actually the salinity and brine, the salt that breaks down the vegetables, that's the catalyst to the fermentation. The salt is the natural, preservative and the catalyst. And then you have the bacteria that already pre-exist in any vegetable in the air, and then, and that causes the lactic acid to happen. So
would it take longer to make a vegan kimchi versus the one with
No.
protein added?
no. The protein you're talking about, the fish sauce or the salted shrimp, it adds the ambience of salinity, in the vegetables. But you can do that by by adding a little bit more salt. So in the vegan kimchi, we have to add a little bit of like sea salt to just create the ambient temperature or the ambient salinity.
Then the Japanese pickles are made with salt, and we don't consider that fermented in Japan. So, just curious.
Oh, I don't know enough about the. Do you know
I don't
about
know
the
enough about
Japanese
Japanese pickles.
pickles?
Sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, because kimchi is by definition, in the Chinese word was, and because I think the Koreans really were using a lot of daikon radish too. So it was just like this idea of the salted, cabbage or the daikon radish that really became, were the kimchi eaters of Asia. I mean, because I think the Chinese have some kimchi recipes as well, although it just never has, I think, been what Koreans have done with the kimchi recipes. So.
For kind of somebody who enjoys cooking, who cooks a lot, can you recommend like the first recipe maybe to go for to really kind of try out kimchi's?
Cucumber.
The cucumber.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that one and the cucumber one is actually the one that I've been teaching at summer camps this past summer, and so tactile and to me that was the way that I learned how to make kimchi when I was little. It was something like to make with my mom and stuff, the cucumber, but it's like once you just start to just take some salt and put it on your vegetable and you smell that the essence of that vegetable and you start to smell the true flavor of a cucumber, then it's like kind of magical. Then you want to like kind of start putting salt on other vegetables. And it's like the most kind of pure way to kind of taste and have flavor of that vegetable. So I think it really piques your interest.